The eternal city of Rome, Italy. And it's so much more than just a city. Originally a republic, a great empire, and a warning. It also happens to be one of the most insane true events ever recorded. Because the achievements of Rome didn't require an industrial revolution. They managed to build structures that endure to this day. Structures that officially have lasted for over 1,000 years, and in some cases over 2,000 years. What's really the mystery behind Rome? Why do we consider it an insane true event? Why is it that Rome is at the nexus point of so much historical understanding? Virtually every set of ruins you come across anywhere along the Mediterranean is attributed to Rome. And yet you'll see things that reflect Rome in far-off places such as Singapore, albeit it's a court building or whatever we're calling it today. And then in the United States, in Philadelphia, where you have the incredible City Hall, built in the 1800s, but today would bankrupt the city to tear it down. Join me as we explore the most insane true events ever recorded. The reenactment. And there are reenactments everywhere across the land. The reenactment of the great Roman legions. It reinforces the notion that this incredible empire of Rome existed. And I can only imagine what sort of fun individuals have. I mean, look at how much fun this guy appears to be having. Dressed up in his armor and his helmet, knowing he gets to spend the entire day doing reenactments in the sun. And it must be fun to play a soldier. In the United States, we enjoy our Civil War reenactments, where everyone gets to don the old wool uniforms and march around in the sun all day. It really instills that. I wonder if down the road are we going to reenact the global war on terror, the incessant meetings between U.S. military officers and local officials, trying to come to a conclusion for a new nation. Would anybody want to reenact that? We begin our exploration by looking at the works of Giovanni Panini, an Italian Baroque fantasy painter and architect, 1691 to 1765. A very interesting individual. And he did a lot of artistic works that were considered fantasy on the landscapes of Rome. He was also an architect. Now, was he an architect in his spare time, or was he a painter in his spare time? Well, based on his works, we come to the conclusion that clearly he was a fantasy painter full-time. But when you look at these works that he did of Rome in this time frame, presumably from the late 1600s, well, actually I should say the 1700s, then what was he really representing? Because a lot of his paintings don't represent actual landscapes. They represent a fantasy landscape where many of the monuments of Rome were fictitiously put together in these paintings. But when you look at them very closely, you see a lot of the details that are accurately captured. So what was Panini really representing in these paintings that he did? Yes, the name of Giovanni appearing so many times in different historical documents. No, not that Giovanni, but if anybody understands that reference, let me know. But you see this interesting compilation of these various structures that we consider famous in Rome, with statues and even a pyramid in the background. Now, while it is true that all these structures, or something resembling them, could be found across Rome today, what exactly was he representing? And why does he have other very accurate representations, such as the interior of St. Peter's in Rome? Well, the explanation will be he was a fantasy painter in some works, and in other works he was accurately reproducing exactly what he saw. But is it possible that there could be another explanation for this variety of paintings that this individual did? And why is it that we have the architect profession that's attributed to him? Here we have this painting of his that was apparently looted during the German occupation of Italy in 1944. Very interesting that the Germans would proudly pose with this picture that they had looted, and that this is still on the historical record. I mean, didn't they know that they were losing the war in 1944? And perhaps not. Their state propaganda had told them they were not going to lose the war, they would win, so therefore once they acquired this painting they were going to pose for it. And there's an easy explanation. Very, very intriguing structure here. Presuming this image is from Naples. Is this a guard post that's very well built, or is it some sort of latrine or bathroom? Going back to the Panini paintings, though, you'll see that there's a compilation of rather unique structures. We have obelisks, we have what we would think of as the Colosseum, we have the ruins of temples, and of course our favorite centaur figure, because why not? I oftentimes question when we see figures such as this, because was mythology really so powerful at the time? And I'm sure the official explanation will be yes, everybody believed in mythology, and therefore it was represented. But we also have other paintings that indicate that there's some sort of turmoil or strife that was going on at this time. Now, granted, this is the 1700s, and depending on what your historical understanding of the 1700s is, whether you got it from a university or whether you achieved it from watching Outlander, it doesn't really matter because there's different perceptions of the time frame. Now, of course, you have to consult a certified historian to know exactly what happened in the official history, but I consider these true events to be rather insane true events because of what they represent. Why is it that we have this painter who was doing these fantasy exhibits and these fantasy renditions of Rome? You would think that even in the 1700s, one could go walking around Rome and find many wondrous landscapes. And you can see the pictures, the very early pictures of Rome taken by the camera, at least as we understand it, in the 1800s, which shows you that it's most certainly not a boring place. In other words, any sort of painter would be able to find just things that they could paint in their immediate field of view without having to comprise these supposed fantasy paintings. But what I want to suggest is, what if Panini really was representing what he saw? Because we do have different representations of such structures as the Pantheon. The Pantheon which we cannot replicate today, because as we understand it, is the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the land. And unreinforced concrete cannot be replicated, because Roman concrete cannot be replicated today, despite all of our great advances in technology and our possession of the incredible and magical artificial intelligence. Although I also find it interesting that artificial intelligence can't replicate these paintings either. You can very easily tell the difference. I'm sure someone will try to argue that point, and who knows, maybe one day it will advance to the point to where it can replicate these paintings. But when you see things like this, and why works of art like this intrigue me, regardless of who they're attributed to, is I have to ask the question, are these really representing something that has been lost in our history? Are we seeing something of Rome being recovered and salvaged? Now, the official history tells us that many times the entire existence and knowledge of the Roman Empire and even the entire Roman civilization was rediscovered multiple times. In fact, in the 1700s, it was one of the times in which it was rediscovered. Now, we can argue whether it was an actual rediscovering. I mean, certainly all these ruins existed across the Italian peninsula for over 1,000 years. And the civilizations, whether they were city-states, the Roman Catholic Church, or whoever, was walking across them every single day and had to see them. Although when you see paintings like this, it causes you to question exactly what sort of reality they were actually encountering at that time. Did they encounter these structures in their full glory, in pristine condition, or had they been grown over? I mean, we've certainly all seen that program, Life After People, where they show that plants and animals quickly cause artificial structures or man-made structures to quickly disappear in the increasing foliage. And some of these paintings do give that impression, but they also give a different impression. They give the impression that the structure and the layout of this city was very different. And is that the reason why there is this assessment, this assignment of these paintings all being fictitious? That they were simply from the imagination of Panini, because he's labeled as a fantasy painter. These were not real-life depictions. But how disturbing, how troubling would it be if there was an element of realism in these paintings? Or what if, in fact, he was actually painting what he really saw exactly as he saw it? Now, that's merely a supposition. The official history tells us that that did not happen, that what he was painting was merely the product of fantasy. But why is it we have this other affiliation with him of being an architect? There's always the discussion that in the past our avocations and our professions were used interchangeably. And because apparently people had so much time on their hands, from the 17 through the 1800s, whether you lived in Italy or the nascent United States, you had a lot of time on your hands, for reasons unknown, to where you could actually engage in a profession, an avocation, and have many different pursuits. It seemed as though there was the opportunity for everybody to be a polymath. But really think about it. What do these paintings actually represent? Is it really just Panini using his imagination of transposing all of these incredible landmarks, these structures in Rome, and making fantasy paintings to create an eternal city that was even more eternal, even more grand and glorious than we see today? Or is it representing something else entirely? Is it representing a Rome that was lost? Or perhaps even an entirely other civilization that was lost? When you look at the works, and there's no shortage of works, and Panini's certainly not the only artist whose drawings, paintings, sketches, engravings, whatever we choose to call them today, have reached us in this present day. But looking at them, I think it's important to remember it's supposed to show us how the people of that time viewed their presence and their present situation. One thing that Ken Burns said is that we understand in our present situation, we evaluate ourselves by how we viewed the past. But what that's doing is that's imposing our own perceptions on the past. He's openly saying that we're not seeing the past exactly as it was, and we're certainly not seeing it through the eyes of the people that really lived through it. I think that's that's an important facet to understand. Because the people who really did live through it, even if the history did happen exactly as we understand it to have happened, they saw it very differently. And how did they really see it? How is it possible that a structure and an interior like this was completed at any time in the past? Are we simply going to accept that logistical impossibilities and that very difficult situations were achieved? I mean, we certainly accept that the Roman civilization managed these incredible and stellar achievements simply because of the fact that they had infinite manual labor. And, of course, forced labor. That's the official explanation behind it. Forced labor mixed with an incredible engineering understanding. And yet, many of the structures that you can come across in Rome today, such as St. Peter's, they were certainly not built by the Roman civilization, but by the successor civilizations. There was a Renaissance. There were polymaths, such as Michelangelo and Da Vinci, who were involved in the construction and designing of these structures. Of course, I can also say with total certainty that nobody is designing structures like this today. No one is thinking about them. Now let's take a look at Giovanni Piranesi. And here we have a classical archaeologist, an architect, and an artist. And about the same time frame as Panini, another individual named Giovanni. Again, not to be confused with this Giovanni. And here we have another situation of an artist who is also an architect. Now, Piranesi here is famous, and this is apparently a self-portrait. This is a very, very odd self-portrait because some of the most famous self-portraits by artist Van Gogh, he never attempted a profile picture. And why would someone do a picture of themselves in a coin? Well, I guess it does replicate a good Roman coin because there's not a year affiliated with it. But with Piranesi, you'll actually see the same sort of art that you saw with Panini. And yet he's most famous for doing these fantasy drawings of what are called the prisons. Now, once again, the official historical explanation for this insane true event is that he was simply doing a parody, if you will. These prisons represent the political satire of the time, that Italy had been unduly influenced by the Greek influences and Greek culture. Now, that's a very intriguing position to take because when you look at some of these images from Piranesi, you get the idea that once again, he seems to be really drawing, and most of these are drawings, but again, we'll have different names for them, engravings, renderings, sketches. But he does seem to be capturing exactly what he's seen on the landscape. Now, it is true, there is that very intriguing pyramid that you can see in Rome that's not too far from the Aurelian walls. But it really causes you to question the existence of how Rome really was. The Colosseum, the amphitheaters, all the great forums. And why is it that everything seems to mix together there? Well, the city's been around for a long period of time, and there's been numerous civilizations, and they very easily build on top of one another. Although, is that exactly what happened? Or did something else entirely happen when you look at these works of art, whether they're paintings or sketches? And whether we're looking at the works of Panini or Piranesi, we do see the incredible arches that were attributed to Rome. It's also interesting to note, though, that we had no shortage of victory and triumph arches that appeared in places such as the United States. There were many arches that were done after the Spanish-American War and World War I. Now, of course, we're assured that these were temporary structures, but it's certain to say that the victory arches that endure to this day in Rome are certainly not temporary structures. So what is the real situation? What is this really reflecting when we look at this? And yes, people may be annoyed by the questions, but if you just take this all at face value, then you realize it doesn't really make a lot of sense, and it can just be categorized as an insane true event. It's what really happened because it's what's been relayed to us. And maybe that is indeed the situation. Or maybe our reality has some elements of insanity to it. But trying to step back and really deconflict the overlapping events and structures that we see, what's the explanation behind these prison drawings that Piranesi did? Was he really reflecting something that was just in his imagination to communicate some sort of bizarre political satire? Or once again, was he actually reflecting a reality that he was able to truly view? And this is where I think we get the interesting premise behind these works, because if these were reflecting what he was actually looking at, then what was he really looking at? Is it possible that there were subterranean structures that were laid out in this very manner? And if these were structures that did once exist, what exactly happened to them? Were they actually structures that were part of surviving some sort of reset event or some sort of cataclysm? Or did they represent something else entirely? We've had the theories on this channel that it may be possible that there was some sort of incredible event that involved tricking the population to seek refuge in these incredible subterranean compounds, and that once the population had taken up residence within these subterranean compounds, safety was not what they were constructed for. In fact, they were constructed to do terrifying things to the population, whether it was simply killing off the people or doing all sorts of horrific experiments on them. And while this might be the very darkest of possibilities for what happened here, how else would you exactly explain these sketches of these prisons if taken at face value? What if that's exactly what they were? And that the actual replication of what this artist saw when he did these drawings, the only way he was going to get them published was by simply saying that it involved a element of political humor, that you could really say that that's what he was showing? Or could it even be possible that that affiliation and explanation for this artwork was assigned later? That the only way you could explain it was he was simply doing a political satire. Yes, that's the beauty about satire. And of course you can find a great example in modern times of satire by comparing the films of RoboCop from 1987 to RoboCop 2. And tell me which one's the better satire. Tell me which film feels more real between the two of them. And how does that comparison apply here? Well, look at these incredible sketchings. Look at these works of art. Would someone really go to the trouble of replicating this prison? And why is it that there's certain geometric and various impossibilities that are shown if you look closely at a lot of this artwork? Was that the only way it was ever going to get published? Because if you did a completely real and adequate reproduction, would it have ever been remembered if it was something that was never intended to be remembered? Now, of course, people will trust exactly what they're told, and they believe exactly what's been relayed to them, and it may be possible that everything that's been relayed to us is true. And I concede that there is a possibility that, yes, the artist was simply using their imagination to communicate the political events at the time, much in the same way that director Paul Verhoeven was using his imagination to communicate extreme satire in the 1987 film RoboCop. But why is it when you look at works such as this and you try to reconcile them with the historical events that were going on at the time? You understand that the 1700s was apparently a period of transition. It was well after the period of the Renaissance, and so that's how we explain this interesting overlap that we have of some people having knowledge and yet other people still believing in the concept of witches and very superstitious in many ways. And yet you look at these images and you have this really bizarre amalgamation of technology and torment that's being shown. If this is a prison, then what's really the purpose behind it? Or was it actually that structure where people were tricked into going, where they were tormented, and their descendants were tormented? Or could you even say it was a prison compound that was for the surviving prisoners that were taken to the previous civilization? And this is where they were relocated and where they were controlled and re-indoctrinated before the survivors were allowed to go out and repopulate the land. There's many different possibilities and explanations. And certainly it's not something that would ever be allowed to remain in the official history or even in the collective memory of those that survived. And so, in what manner would it survive? And you'd probably be asking the question, well, why would anybody allow it to ever be seen by anybody? Well, perhaps that was the only way it could have been seen. That it was affiliated with a political satire, that it was merely from the imagination of these two artists. That you can only see certain glimpses of what came before, but it will always be with that questionable element that it's merely a fantasy, that it's not something that really existed. It's from the imagination. Apparently, people had great imaginations during a time when people weren't supposed to be allowed to have a great imagination. Yes, we understand the society of this time was that you were told what to believe and you believed it and you openly expressed it, and how much dissent with that was truly tolerated. Well, I'll just remind you, there was this event in the 1600s from the history that we're told about called the 30 Years' War, which talked about how there was total intolerance. But it's also interesting how the concept of intolerance goes back and forth in our official history. Sometimes we understand there's total intolerance, but then other times there is tolerance. It's very, very intriguing to really look at it. But what do you think these images are really showing? What do you think's really being reflected here? Is this just some sort of political satire representation from the mind of an artist who, either in his spare time or his full time, he was an architect? It seemed like everybody in Italy from this time frame was an architect as either their avocation or their profession, and of course I'm speaking in jest, but yet when you go back and you look at all the officials that we have recorded in history from this time, they all seem to have architect tacked onto their areas of expertise in some way, shape, or form. In fact, even with the construction of the Kremlin, we understand that the architect came over from Italy to the Russian Empire to lay it out. Even though we have other Kremlin-like structures, it just means citadel in Russia, that were constructed and do have certain details of the same elaborate construction as the Kremlin in Moscow. So what really to make of it all? It seems as though we have multiple converging historical events, and yet we have details that do shine true in each of these artistic representations. Really think about what kind of horror these prisons would be if they did actually exist. Of course, we always talk about how terrible prisons can be, and our understanding that in the past, prisons and, of course, the asylums, the ubiquitous asylums that we had in the 1800s, they were not happy places. And that's why over time, as our society officially evolved, we had to close them all down. And yet, for some unknown reason, certain processes are still retained by our current civilization. Now, do you accept the official explanation that that's just because it's the will of the people, or is there another reason for these processes being retained? What do these symbols actually reflect within these drawings, these etchings? Do they really reflect the political satire, or do they reflect some other symbols of perhaps a former civilization, or even the very entity that the civilization fell to? It's hard to say, but there's so many different possibilities, and they're all very compelling. Because when you look at these sketches, you'll see the signs of architecture from this so-called neoclassical period. And you also see many implements of terrifying destruction and torment. So what's really the truth? It's ultimately up to you to decide, but we have so many clues and indications that say otherwise. Horses are something that explain a lot of our civilization's advancements, and clearly they were the main beast of burden in the construction and logistical support of our civilization as we understand it. Yes, wonderful animal, horses, but what's their true capability? Yes, don't blame me for this particular costume on King Arthur. I can't say that it's one that I necessarily agreed with. A very interesting aesthetic for the legend of the sword. We have accounts that there were horse elevators in Manhattan in New York City. Now, what would be the reason to have a horse elevator? Well, there's very little photographic documentation of this. That's not to say it didn't happen, but evidently the explanation is that the real estate at the highest levels, or what we consider the penthouse today, was inhabited by horses. Now, how does this make any sense? Why would you have an elevator just to take a horse all the way to the top floor and then bring it all the way back to the surface where the horse was primarily employed as the main form of transportation, whether it was hauling people around in a carriage or in terms of logistics? It's a very odd account, and I just thought it was something we'd address. What exactly are your thoughts behind these horse elevators? Do they make any sense? Why would anybody bother to put a horse in an elevator and haul it all the way to the top floor of a structure? Could it be possible that there's an entirely different explanation behind these large elevators? For example, if the structures, as we've theorized, actually have a different purpose, these tall high-rises or the skyscrapers in New York City, and of course it's the point of historical contention, which city had the first skyscraper? Was it Chicago or was it New York? Well, just depends on the day that you're looking at it. Of course, Chicago claims that it has the first skyscraper. Maybe they both had skyscrapers at the exact same time. Who knows for sure? But if you actually had these powerful and incredible elevators, were they really being used to haul horses, which makes absolutely no sense, to the top floor of these structures, or were they being used to haul something else? Maybe just large numbers of people that were going to the top of the building to board some sort of flying device. Maybe that's just a crazy theory and we shouldn't go any further with it, because it certainly makes sense. It's not an insane true event that horses were hauled into these elevators and then taken to the very top floor. Also think about the logistics of how exactly do you feed horses and then clean up the vast amounts of horse feces that would suddenly compile in these penthouse areas. It's almost as though these people who come up with these explanations don't think of these little details. Now, I'm not suggesting that our history is incorrect, merely questioning some things that I wonder if perhaps there were some mistakes made with the recording of these events. Because we count on the horse to explain our incredible construction, especially with the rise of the United States, the rapid construction of many cities across the United States at the same amount of time. Look at the amount of growth that occurred in the United States between the years 1800 and 1900. Does it make perfect sense to accept it at face value? Or is it possible that really what it was simply a salvage operation? And that as time went on, eventually the technology was repurposed. Yes, you can find some rather humorous photos of individuals taking a horse and bringing it into an elevator, but that's the closest thing you'll find to an image of any sort of horse actually traversing an elevator. You certainly won't find any images of horses going up these actual purpose-built horse elevators that are completely disappearing from Manhattan because the old world buildings are disappearing. But you will find an image like this, where it's really just a paradox. So were these actually horse elevators, or did they have a completely different purpose? What are your thoughts on this possibility? Again, I'm not here to tell you what to think, but I will simply say when I think something doesn't make a lot of sense. And it doesn't make a lot of sense to me as to why anybody would come up with the idea of hauling horses up and down a building in an elevator. But maybe that is what they did. Maybe that's one of the reasons why we had so many problems in the past and yet were able to rapidly build cities. Now let's look at the lost and vanished. We have numerous accounts in history of those that have been lost on expeditions and have vanished without a trace. These are compelling historical accounts. And I want to start with the example of an entire army that disappeared. The very compelling and interesting legacy and legend of the army of Cambyses. An army of Persian origin from 525 BC, give or take, that was sent to subdue a rebellious Egyptian faction. Legend goes that this entire army of 50,000, I'm always amazed at how we know these details, disappeared in a sandstorm. Now, common consensus among historians and the historicity of this event is that it's merely a legend. Yet, for some inexplicable reason, this army of 50,000 that disappeared was studied extensively. Indeed, there were investigations that continued into 1980. people were trying to figure out exactly what happened to this army. And there's even a historian that has a theory that some guy who wrote his name on a wall that was found was responsible for ambushing and destroying the entire army. And then it just disappears from history. It's rather similar to the Roman Ninth Legion that disappeared in what is today Great Britain or the United Kingdom. Yes, and then that rather, how shall I say, less than sufficient movie from the 2000s, The Lost Legion. But that's where we had many different movies that were giving us different origins for the legend of King Arthur and Excalibur. There's also this particular individual, this being Sequoia, a Cherokee polymath who was involved during the very difficult wars against the Cherokee, and was also an individual who tried to translate the Cherokee language into something that was able to be understood by the settlers. He was a polymath. How intriguing that we have a Cherokee polymath. He was also present at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. As this was a battle that involved General Andrew Jackson from the United States Army, it was naturally an American victory because General Jackson did not lose battles. It's also interesting to note that I recall there was a time when the U.S. Army Command and General Staff did what was called a staff ride to understand this battle. But then for various reasons they stopped going there and ended up studying several Civil War battles around Atlanta. I can't imagine why. We've also looked at the disappearance of Percy Fawcett, the British explorer who was trying to find the lost city of Z. And there's even a more compelling and I'll say a much finer movie that was made in the last decade about the search for the lost city of Z and the efforts of Percy Fawcett to find it. Now, what are we getting at with this lost and vanished, these accounts spreading over a couple thousand years? What exactly were people always looking for? We have the numerous expeditions that we understand that were committed to trying to find the Northwest Passage, the ability to rapidly traverse from the Atlantic to the Pacific by going through the Arctic Ocean north of North America, or in the archipelago of what is today Canada. And then, of course, there's the synonymous Northeast Passage that goes over northern Asia. But of course, the difficulty being is that these go through areas that have a lot of ice in them. But there was this focus to find these passages to save a lot of time. And why is it we still have that very interesting black circle on the imagery today? I don't know. Maybe it represents where the stick actually goes to the globe. I'm just spitballing. I don't really know. But you look at many of these older maps and they do allude to different passages that people were searching for at the time. And there were different names for it. There was even the legendary Strait of Anian. It's also the place where Captain Cook lost his mind, but we'll get to that in a moment. There's even fictitious maps that are on globes, yes, I'm being quite serious when I say that depict the Northwest Passage. You may recall when we did our earlier exploration of the Panama Canal that there was no canal. The only way to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific was to go all the way south beyond the tip of South America, past Cape Horn, which was very dangerous at the time, or to search for this legendary Northwest Passage. And there were a lot of efforts committed to finding this. There is also this legendary allusion to this Strait of Anian, or however you want to pronounce it. And it's also intriguing to note that the land here, what is today the United States, or North America, is referred to as Anian. All these names that we have on these old maps. Word. Well, I know it doesn't say Greater Tartary, so make of it what you will. But then there's these other maps that show us this Northwest Passage. And for whatever reason, there was a lot of effort dedicated by these exploratory expeditions to try to find this Northwest Passage. But how practical is or was it? Well, as we understand it, according to official history, it wasn't until the very early 20th century that the Northwest Passage was traversed. We've even got some English privateers that were searching for the Northwest Passage in between preying on Spanish shipping, such as Martin Frobisher here. And apparently with his incredible attire, it enabled him to be an effective privateer and explorer. I mean, really, how exactly would you wear ruffles like that around your neck and work on a ship? Well, maybe it was just a style thing. And then, of course, we have Captain Cook here, or Julian Glover, who he kind of resembles in this image, and we've explored all the expeditions that he undertook. Look at that, Captain Cook didn't need any silly globe, he could actually use a map. How incredible. It's intriguing to note that a lot of Captain Cook's early explorations involved doing cartography around a lot of land areas that are known as Canada. And of course, Canada being affiliated with where the legendary Northwest Passage was being sought. So just think about this. All these expeditions, all this effort for a period of hundreds of years trying to locate this Northwest Passage. All these explorers seeking fame. And keep in mind that they certainly had to be aware that this was in a very inhospitable area. John Ross, the British explorer leading the first explorations trying to find the Northwest Passage in the 1800s, following the work of all the explorers who came before him. John Ross is also stated officially to be the first European that reached the magnetic North Pole. But things didn't go so well on his expedition. His ship became trapped in ice, and they had to abandon it and walk quite a long distance until they were rescued by another ship. John Ross came under controversy because he had offered these incredible maps that showed the updated areas and where there were islands and where the sailing could be, when he misidentified an area as mountains, what he called the Crocker Mountains, when in fact he was actually seeing a visible mirage called Ice Blink. What exactly is going on up there with this Northwest Passage? Why do we still have so much mystery with the area of the Arctic Ocean, as it were? Even going up to northern Canada to this day is very problematic. It's just intriguing that there just doesn't seem to be an exact answer. It's also intriguing that we've got hundreds of years of lost expeditions, even as recently as the mid to late 1800s. And the other thing that's incredible about searching for the Northwest Passage is, even if they found it, of what commercial use would it have actually been? You understand that back during this time frame, these were waterways that would be frozen. Certainly they had to understand that the only time they could traverse these waterways for this Northwest Passage would have been 2 to 3 months a year. I suppose that would have been better than nothing, and you may recall when we studied the efforts of utilizing the Isthmus of Panama to save time, Scotland during this time frame tried establishing a business where they would use a land route to haul supplies across the Isthmus of Panama and then load them up on a ship on the Pacific side. Here's an image showing this ice blink phenomenon, where you apparently have mountains in the distance, but they're not really mountains. How interesting, though, that there's all these unique phenomenons that exist in these extreme locations, whether we're talking the Arctic or the Antarctic area. And why is it that there was such a focus on trying to find this route if it wouldn't have been commercially viable? Well, you can only take it 2 to 3 months a year, and you may recall there's a lot of risk involved in it. Now here's the question I have for you for today. How many shipping lanes do we actually have that make use of the Northwest Passage? There's also something interesting when you look at the construction of the Distant Early Warning Line, a Cold War effort undertaken by the United States and Canada after World War II. And then we've explored the different poles that we have, the actual North Pole, the magnetic pole, and then the so-called pole of inaccessibility. And then we get to the piece of resistance in exploring for the Northwest Passage, the Franklin expedition. Considered to be one of the most scientifically advanced expeditions launched in the 1840s to finally find the Northwest Passage, continuing the work of John Ross, who believed he was very close. And it's very intriguing that this legend of the difficulties encountered by this real expedition, and it should be noted it is a very well documented historical expedition. There are many pictures, and there's been many books written about it, to include Dan Simmons, coincidentally the individual who wrote Hyperion's work called The Terror, which was named after one of the ships of the two-ship expedition. And there was also the eponymous Terror TV series that came out last decade. Very well acted and yet very, you'll excuse the pun, terrifying series that showed what happened when this expedition disrupted a balance of nature, as though it was alluding to an entirely different set of possibilities that were going on. Now, there's all these images that we have, these very early photos, because remember this was the 1840s, that very well document the individuals on the Franklin expedition, such as John Franklin himself pictured right here. I just always found the detail very intriguing because we understand that photography was in its infancy at this time. But whether you want to call these actual pictures or daguerreotypes or whatever other technical names that we have for these images, some of them are quite striking. Such as this image here of Captain Francis Crozier, who was the captain of the Terror. Now, was this image improved over time? Was it colorized? That would be our understanding. But it is quite a detailed image from the 1840s. And it's not just the expedition leader and then, of course, the captains of the two ships. So here we have Captain James Fitzjames, who in the TV series The Terror was portrayed by Tobias Menzies. He was the captain of the Erebus, which was the flagship of the expedition. But just think about that. We have a photographic record of the expedition leader and the two captains of the two ships. Now, the official historical explanation will be, well, this was a very well-documented expedition. It had the greatest advances of technology. And if you've seen the TV series The Terror, you've got the acting efforts of two incredible actors who portray the two commanders of the ships. Those being Jared Harris as Captain Crozier on the left and Tobias Menzies as Captain Fitzjames on the right. It's also interesting to note, though, that when they filmed this series, they filmed it in Croatia. They never actually went to the Arctic to film it. That was all done with movie magic. Although here in this photograph from this exact area where the expedition perished, you have the headstones for the members of the crew that died during the expedition. What we understand is that the two ships trying to find the Northwest Passage became locked in ice, and when it became clear that the ships were unable to be freed after a couple winters, the crews then attempted to walk to the nearest settlement, much as they had done in the Ross expedition, and they unfortunately perished. Yet when you look at this particular image here, we think these are drawings. These are clearly drawings that are based on the photographs that we looked at earlier. We have every leader of the expedition very well documented. And I find that very, very fascinating because we have other incredible expeditions that are not quite this well documented. What we understand is that part of the preparation for the Franklin expedition is they had the latest technology at the time. Both of the ships actually had steam engines that were brought from the nascent trains at the time, and their hulls were reinforced. We know the fact, according to the official history, that the ships were locked in the ice because of the victory note pictured here. How very interesting, all the things that they had hand-jammed on this note, and then of course you have the multiple different languages for any other explorers who might be poking around up here in northern Canada trying to find the Northwest Passage, with the request that the note be forwarded to the Admiralty in the United Kingdom. And then of course you have the hand-jammed note at the bottom that talks about the ships being stuck in the ice, and Francis Crozier and James Fitzsimmons, the two captains, after John Franklin had passed away after they had become trapped in the ice. Now, what exactly really happened here? We don't know for sure. We have a lot of speculation. We actually have the book The Terror that speculates exactly what happened, where there was a supernatural event that was involved with the destruction of the entire crew. But it is very intriguing to think that all this effort was put into all this kind of exploration. And then there's the even more disturbing notion, is it possible that there's actually a lot more land up there? Now, again, the official history will tell you that there is nothing supernatural that happened, that these ships simply became trapped in the ice, and that the crews simply vanished trying to walk to the nearest settlement, which was quite a distance away. Although, considering how long they were really out there and how far they had to travel, it's rather intriguing to think of what other possibilities there could have been. Now, I do want to highlight the fact that very recently, we did actually have definitive evidence in terms of what happened to the crews of these ships. It's also worth noting, here we have this incredible monument in Northern Ireland that's dedicated to Captain Francis Crozier, and you can see he's got quite the old world monument that's been dedicated to him. We see the touches of old world architecture, and there's a lot of effort that's been put into it. And it should be noted that Captain Crozier was not the expedition leader, although, based on what we understand of the story, he did the most to try to ensure the survival of the crew. And here we have the monument to John Franklin, the expedition leader who perished, and we notice that it's rather a newer monument or memorial, and it certainly doesn't have the touches of old world construction to it. What an interesting comparison. one would certainly expect John Franklin to have a much more, how shall we say, embellished monument. But for whatever reason, Captain Crozier has what I would dare say is the more ornate monument. But that's just my opinion. And we do actually have confirmation of where the remains of the ships were found in northern Canada and the archipelagos. And here in the areas you can see where each of the ships were found. Yes, they have actually found the hulls of the ship underwater. And you can see where the holes were found and where Victory Point, where they found the note in the very unique built-up little pyramid of rocks that they had, and where the ships were actually abandoned. So what an intriguing story. And then, of course, the historical documentation that indicates the reward being offered to find the expedition or what remained of these ships after they disappeared. Now, you can watch the TV series The Terror to see a relatively accurate documentation in terms of what happened with launching these rescue parties. But officially, the rescue parties never actually found anything. They only had some clues from some of the locals that they had talked to, the local Inuit population, who indicated that the crew was just simply wandering around the ice, trying to make their way to the nearest settlement. Now keep in mind, this wasn't in the 1700s or the 1600s, this was in the mid-1800s, shortly before the United States Civil War. So very, very intriguing with this expedition that all this effort that was very well documented was put into. It should also be noted that one of the other historical details given is that the hulls of both of these ships were reinforced to be able to survive being trapped in the ice. Well, we apparently do have photography of the hulls underwater as they were discovered, just last decade, mind you, when they found both the Terror and the Erebus. Very, very impressive that the hulls of both of these ships survived, being trapped in ice for how many years, decades or longer, and then they're still relatively intact being underwater. Now, I'm not questioning the veracity of these reports. If they tell us that they found these ships, we have no reason to question that. I'm merely complimenting the fact that apparently there was some incredible construction abilities with the hulls of wooden ships in the 1840s that they were able to undertake for both of these ships to ensure that they would survive so the hulls could be located last decade. Because it's exactly what they tell us. In fact, it was just before the airing of the show The Terror that they announced that expeditions had found these hulls. So what exactly do you think about all this? Do you think that this is practicable and that this totally makes sense? Why was there this intense effort to always go to these far-off locations in these tundra environments? Was this all in the name of exploration? And we've certainly looked at this account before, and the understanding is that it was simply for fame and recognition. John Ross had a lot of fame and recognition, at least until he came under criticism for misidentifying the Crocker Mountains because of ice blink. One of the other expeditions that we haven't necessarily explored is the expedition of Robert Falcon Scott to the Antarctica. Again, someone else who wanted to take a lot of effort to go explore some extreme environment to be the first person to do it. Although, as we understand it, in the very early 20th century, Robert Falcon Scott's expedition met with disaster. And he wasn't the first to the South Pole anyways. Bears a striking resemblance to Sky Marshal Inoki. I can't help but find the similarity in this image of Robert Falcon Scott. For some reason, it reminds me of Richard E. Byrd, right down to even having the smoking pipe. But there was a lot of differences between these expeditions. But I ask you, what do you think they were really looking for? What were these expeditions really about? What we were told they were about historically? Or something else? Either way, it does seem to be quite an insane true event. Welcome, channel members, and today we're going to explore Florence Cathedral, the original building number 1 in the explorations of the Lucius Aurelian channel. You may be surprised to know that Florence Cathedral was actually the original building number 1 instead of the Iowa State Capitol. And you're probably going to be asking, why isn't it the current building number 1? Well, in this exploration, we're going to explain all that. But first, I thought we'd start just by going around the cathedral and taking a close look at it. The interesting thing about this cathedral is we are told by the mainstream historical account that this was the first quintessential cathedral that really kicked off the entire Renaissance building phase. This actually preceded the Great Basilica of St. Peter's, and yet conversely, this also still has a larger dome than St. Peter's. In fact, the dome on this Florence cathedral is the largest stonemason dome in the world to this day. And if you've ever actually been at this cathedral, you get a series of conflicting emotions, and yet in the same token, you're very awed by what you witness in the actual construction. It has a very unique feel of not just modernity, and I'm really not a fan of that word, but also of something that's far more advanced than what we tend to associate with cathedrals. Now, you can certainly go to the Great Cathedral in Cologne, Germany, and be amazed at its size and immensity, and yet recall that it does not have a dome that matches the dome of this cathedral in Florence. There's also something about the structure that indicates that it's far more advanced than what we're originally told. And yet this is supposed to be the baseline, the prototype of cathedrals that were constructed during the Renaissance. It might also interest you to note that it was the explorations of Florence Cathedral that was the final tripping point for me to realize that everything that I had been taught in academia and about our true history could not be correct. And I'm going to explain that in this exploration for how I came to that conclusion. But as you look at Florence Cathedral, the reason why I think it's so important to share and why it's difficult to discuss is that this is such an obvious example of something that cannot be true, that is conflicted in the mainstream account, and just simply witnessing it with your own eyes, this defies any ability to be explained by any means of technology or any understanding that we have of the mainstream account. So let's begin our exploration of Florence Cathedral. So I'm going to proceed a little bit more deliberately here and a little bit more slowly because I want to share the revelation that I had back when I first read this article. The title of this article is Mystery of Florence's Cathedral Dome May Be Solved. This was published and available online in 2014. In fact, I think they still have it up here. Yep, February 10th, 2014. 5-minute read. This was the article that you could say was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back in my understanding and awareness of the world. And it actually started from the very beginning with this particular image. Now, let me give you some context. 2014, I was very settled in my role in the world, as I thought of it at the time. I was enjoying my status and research efforts with the university, and I thought life was pretty good. And yet at the same time, I couldn't help but shake the feeling that something seemed to be increasingly amiss. And for me, it really started in 2013. But it was shortly after 2013 that I saw this article. Now, was it fate? Was it some other force intervening? Or was it just the fact that I was being aware and I was questioning things? Well, you know which one I prefer to embrace, but I'm open to all possibilities. And it was this caption on this image right here. The precision of the Santa Maria del Fiore Cathedral's famous dome would be difficult to recreate today, even with modern laser levels, GPS positioning devices, and specialized software. Why was that caption the straw that broke the back of the camel, in the proverbial saying? Because for me, I realized we could not build this structure today, because we do not. We have never built a structure like this since the 1900s, all the way up until 2014 at the time, which was over 10 years ago already. Wow, it's hard to imagine it's been that long. It feels like 100 lifetimes ago to me. It's amazing how different I was prior to reading this article. But I realized that, and that was really something I couldn't shake. I understood that moment that it's not because we can't. It's not because we can. It's not because we opt not to. Well, what's the reality behind it? The reality is, there is no dome like this. There is no structure like this that's been built in the modern era since 1900 until today. But then I started thinking on it more, and I looked at what we're told were the construction dates of other structures, and I saw the intricacies and the contradictions, and I realized it was probably up until about 1940, at least in the United States, although the date seems to vary in other portions of the land, or the world as I thought of it at the time, And I realized that from 1950 onward, there was never any structure that was built like this. We're only told of structures that they're supposedly modifying or altering. But I realized that Florence Cathedral's dome was the real mystery. And it was odd to me that this article was so direct about it. And I'll go over it with you. Nearly 6 centuries after it was completed, a cathedral known around the world as El Duomo. Now, I'm going to say something to you. Pronunciations, different languages, it is impossible for someone to jump from many different languages and properly pronounce everything all at the same time. And it's not efficient to look up when you're trying to speak to properly pronounce things at the same time. There's a reason why professors and people who study different things across the land oftentimes poke fun at each other for the pronunciations. If you think about it, there's not just a language barrier between us, there's also a dialect barrier between us. Case in point, American English, British English. Laboratory, laboratory. Which is right, which is wrong, I don't really care. And if somebody has an issue with that, well, then all they're doing is they're simply engaging in an obstacle that keeps you from intellectually exploring what you're not supposed to intellectually explore. So I'm just saying that to you as well. And here's where it really comes down to. Built without flying buttresses or freestanding scaffolding, using experimental methods that many contemporaries believed would surely fail. What contemporaries? The 150-foot wide, 46-meter wide dome effectively ignited the creative explosion known as the Renaissance. Now, it should be noted, whether you're familiar with this cathedral or not, the actual build time frame on it. We're told that they started building it in 1296. And they completed it in 1436. Yes, another one of these 100-year-plus cathedrals that they did. What's even more amazing about this one, though, is that they consider this Renaissance architecture, even though we know that 1296 greatly preceded what we're told is officially the Renaissance. And so again, that was more of the dings that was coming up in my mind, that something was not making sense. How could they say this was a Renaissance structure when it was constructed well before the Renaissance structure? This gets better. Last April 15th, on the 567th anniversary of Brunelleschi's death, I stood in the portal of the Florence Cathedral. And for those of you who don't know, I skipped over this part. Its creator, Filippo Brunelleschi, a homely, hot-tempered goldsmith with no serious architectural training, is a hero to his fellow Florentines, and to one modern architect in particular. And so we hear the story about this modern architect as he follows Brunelleschi's, and as you can see, it's kind of the template for all the stories that we have for these great architects. Brunelleschi was not an architect, he was a goldsmith. He had no experience in designing buildings or laying out buildings or supervising their construction. And yet we're supposed to believe that he was so innovative, that he was a true original polymath, that he managed to invent this entire structure. And not only that, but also invent and lay out different aspects of it. Although where the story gets even more confusing is that he had nothing to do with the original groundbreaking or design of the cathedral. What he was contracted for was to complete the dome. And here's something else that should get your ears rising. He was also a patron of Cosimo de' Medici. And you might recall when we looked at the Medicis in the Renaissance, they are attributed for everything. And so when you start putting all these pieces together, you start to realize that this feels like a very elaborately constructed account from someone's mind, that someone's not recording events, that someone is constructing things, because nothing about this makes sense when you really start to think it through. You have this individual who was a goldsmith, who was contracted only to build the dome of this cathedral. That's all this individual was contracted to build, just the dome. They had supposedly built the rest of it at that time, but the dome needed to be finished. Remember, to this day, this is still the largest stonemason brick dome. There is nothing that compares to this, and there probably never will be, at least not in this era. But what's even more intriguing is that it only took them 16 years to build the dome. So the hardest part of the structure, prior to the Renaissance, because remember this was the event that kicked off the Renaissance, was built in 16 years. And so when you really start to pull this apart, when you really start to look at this account, and then you try to look at the excuses, yes, of course, they were building it during the Black Death, the bubonic plague. Well, that should be a reason to hold up construction. But then when they found this Brunelleschi guy, and yes, again, they had a competition, because what else would they have? You start to notice that there are the familiar story beats that we have for all the architecture that we have, from this little cathedral all the way until really the 1930s. And it's amazing how many of the basic plot elements, and yes, I'm using those words very choice, are repeated. Back to the article. And they talk about the anniversary of Brunelleschi's death, the goldsmith who became the master architect because he felt like it. The procession descended into the crypt to lay wreaths on his slab. A portly gentleman in his early 70s bent down and laid his hand on the marble, his head bowed reverently, his breathing inaudible. And then we listen to this story about Ricci, who had spent much of his life trying to work out the construction techniques that Brunelleschi used to build the dome. Ricci is the modern architect who has a connection with Brunelleschi. You've seen the issue. And even the article here says it. Still the largest masonry dome on Earth. 2014, and guess what? It still is in 2024. Ricci's identification with Brunelleschi has been so intense that at times he says he almost feels the great architect standing silent and invisible beside him. "We've developed a special, almost spiritual relationship," Ricci says in his throaty growl. "Sometimes I'm filled with gratitude for what he accomplished, what he left us. Other times he frustrates me so much, I tell him to go to hell." Ah, yes, that must be because if we go off of the official account, this architect was far greater than Ricci could even understand, and it frustrates him. And I can appreciate that. And of course, we have all this talk about spirituality in a National Geographic article, which is quite intriguing, but we know they're just trying to combine humanism with spirituality again. To this day, we don't know where he got the inspiration for the double shell dome, the herringbone brickwork, and the other features that architects through ensuing centuries could only marvel at. This was the key paragraph right here that made me realize, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that these are structures, these are buildings, starting with the Florence Cathedral, that we could never build today. We don't even try to imagine them today. Now, every excuse in the book is used to try to justify this, to try to say, well, yes, we could do this. We have safety standards, it's prohibitively expensive, and, I lampoon them in every single exploration. You're well familiar with them. But it was this paragraph here that really struck me. And if you've ever seen Apocalypse Now, when Colonel Kurtz talks about being shot in the head with a diamond bullet, this was the diamond bullet that went right through my head right here. I realized there was no denying this, that this was the reality. Nobody can build Florence Cathedral to this day. Every nation on Earth, if they work together and put all their resources into it, with all the greatest architects, all the greatest contractors, and every resource we had, they could not build Florence Cathedral. Prove me wrong. All they can do is they can try to fool us. And that's what we see. And here it is. Perhaps the most haunting mystery is the simplest of all. How did Brunelleschi and his masons position each brick, stone beam, and other structural element with such precision inside the vastly complex cathedral, a task that modern architects, with their laser levels, GPS positioning devices, and CAD software would still find challenging today? No, they wouldn't find it challenging today. They would find it impossible. And how can I say that? Because nobody does this today. Nobody even thinks of doing this today. You know the kind of buildings that we build today. And of course, again, we always go down with our excuses of our conflicting economic systems, and that's how we try to explain it. But there is no explaining it. We supposedly have very eccentric billionaires who have infinite resources. They don't try to do this. And so that's where it all comes down. And this was the article that really prompted me to realize there was something off about this. Now, to answer the question, why is Florence Cathedral not building number one in the Restitutor Orbis channel's explorations? You might realize, and I'm sure you picked up on the fact, that many explorations are, how shall we say, not well received. There's a system out there that seems to pay attention to certain things that are very obvious. Florence Cathedral is one of those very obvious examples. But there are many other examples, things that you simply can't talk about. You might have noticed that the most recent exploration that was just released Thursday, or the 7th, at least USA Eastern Time, had a lot of, how shall we say, obstruction to it. I found out that the more obvious a structure is, when it comes down to how it would reach any objective mind, and how many objective minds are out there, I'm not really sure. But for whatever reason, those ones seem to be the most difficult to talk about. There are other ones that are very obvious that don't seem to have any obstruction to them. It's very interesting. So I don't know if it's something in the programming or if it's just something that people are watching out for. But I tried to make 3 videos on Florence Cathedral as my initial first exploration for the channel. none of them worked out. They all had extreme technical difficulties. And at that point in the nascent phase of the channel, I had no idea how to work around them. So I had to find something else, and I realized that with the Iowa State Capitol so nearby and that nobody had really covered that, I felt my way out with the Iowa State Capitol and found that I could actually talk about it and explore it. And so that's the simple reason why it became building number one. It's a great example, and again, it defies the historical account that we're given. But even the Iowa State Capitol does not directly defy and contradict the historical account as much as Florence Cathedral. In fact, I would dare say it doesn't even come close. Now, moving on with looking at Florence Cathedral, I will say that the Wikipedia article is actually historically accurate, and it shows many of the great aspects to it. The interior of the dome. And here in the interior of the dome, you can see that there's some very interesting decorations on it. And now you're probably wondering, okay, so this was going to be building number one for the Restitutor Orbis channel. This was going to be your baseline building that you would compare all of their structures to understand and define what you consider to be old world architecture or architecture that was from a previous civilization. Absolutely. What I will tell you, though, is there is an academic account that still exists that was supposedly written by the original architect. And it's very intriguing because when you look at the official account and the original architect, at least of the dome, Brunelleschi, because Brunelleschi was not the original designer of the cathedral. He just did the dome. But it's the dome that still baffles people. But really, the entire structure should baffle people. Because it's not just the dome that's the most amazing aspect about it. Now, the interior of the dome, and when you look at this written account from Brunelleschi that is oftentimes disregarded for many reasons, and I'll explain why. That original account from Brunelleschi indicates that, yes, the cathedral was already standing. Now, if you look at the mainstream account, it will tell you, yes, the cathedral was already standing, but the dome needed to be completed. But according to this other written account, and who knows when this really happened? I mean, we're told that this happened in the 1400s, but like I said, and like I always say, determining the actual timeline before 1850 is problematic. And really, I'm starting to think it's quite problematic all the way up until as late as 1930, 1940. Do years actually pass the same? Is time track the same? Or are we just told that we have a very well-documented chronological account in terms of how time passes? That's why I always encourage you to watch the date paradox video. But what this conflicting account of Brunelleschi says is you get the impression that Brunelleschi was actually just some contractor that they hired to redecorate this actual structure. And indeed, when you look at some of the aspects behind it, these paintings, these were things I think that somebody could have done. You know, we know we have people who can paint effectively, and redecorating certain things to give a different impression, painting would be one of the best ways to do it. Or it could simply be divinely inspired paintings from the previous era. But it's odd when you consider that account, and it's hard to discern exactly what happened, and that's why there's a lot of guesswork involved in these explorations. And so many people were all conditioned to think it's either A or B. It can't be A and B, or C, a completely different explanation. So why am I mentioning all this? These paintings could be from the previous civilization, or they could be something that was done to redecorate it to give it a different flavor. You will notice that when you look at this cathedral and the overall aspects of it, it doesn't really look like any other cathedral that we've come across. Now, what's my overall theory now on this cathedral after doing more explorations? I believe that this was a much more advanced building, that this had many other purposes, and that this represents some of the height of the technological capability of the Fourth Era. For whatever reason, there were certain survivors, examples of these structures, that remain in Italy. Now, do geographical regions have different discernments in terms of what kind of level of destruction that they endured, whether it was from the reset or artificial forces that was imposing it? All possible. I don't know. I've got many different working theories, though. But in terms of that account that it's very difficult to find about how the original architect, at least the dome architect, was actually just renovating the building and changing it, you also have an account about some very strange peculiarities with the building. Now, I like showing this image of the dome because when you look closely at this one, you can see people up here and you can get an idea for just how large this dome really is. And let me zoom in a little bit more here, and you can actually see individuals right here. And this just gives you an appreciation for how large this dome really is. And what exactly is going on top here with this structure? And there seem to be many different functions and purposes behind this dome, and also when you look at the overall structure of it. Now, they try to tell us that they refacaded it and redecorated it in the intervening years, but it doesn't look like it's ever been redecorated or refacaded in any ways when you look at all the little details. And again, just the impressive size and immensity of these portal windows. You are really glancing at something that is a technological marvel that is beyond our ability to do to this day. And not just a little bit, but quite extensively beyond our ability to do to this day. And there's something about this cathedral that indicates it's more advanced than the other structures we've looked at. And now I save the best for last, as I always do. And that's concerning the main portal. Now, what's the real reason behind the main portal? I am not going to tell you what to think on this one, but what I will ask that you do is that you analyze these images and see what's really represented on these main portals, because this is most certainly not repainted, and this seems to represent the original purpose behind the structure. And perhaps it's depicted on the doors here. And there's some very unique symbolism that's really shown. But again, I'm not going to tell you what to make of it. It might actually have the religious undertones that we believe that it does. And I've suspected that the main tenets of our baseline religions are far older than we like to imagine. And they go all the way back to the very beginning of all the civilizations that we've had. And it would make a lot of sense that we have baseline tenets of our religion that are very old, because they come across as being old. And that would also be a way that you could obfuscate the account if you reference that. But you'll see that there is a different working of images here that seems to be a little bit different than what we see on other cathedrals. And at the same time, there's some similarities, to be fair. Oh yes, the old spiral pattern, always present. What exactly does that indicate? But the most telling part of the cathedral, and that's something that many people overlook. Oh, you also have this huge 24-hour clock. Very interesting. Also, the image of how the clock is tracked. But finally, we're given attention on the dome, but perhaps the most amazing aspect to it is the perspective illusion on the floor of the cathedral. And this is something that when you look at this will really blow your mind. Because the original account in some of the rumors that this cathedral had far greater technological capability. Why would anybody, at any point in time, especially in the era of Christianity, want to put a forced perspective image on the floor of a cathedral? And there are many other images for this. And you can see when people actually walk on it what it looks like from above. Very, very interesting. And this is where it comes down to the alternative account, alternative perception that this cathedral was something so much more, that this was a great piece of technology. Now, when you look at the floor from this perspective, it just looks like a floor. But when you look at it from above, you suddenly see how the dimensions behind it change. Again, representing the increased concept of existence. The reality that what is just a two-dimensional floor, when you look at it, can suddenly appear three-dimensional. And things get even more confusing and mysterious when there's accounts that the cross that was originally on top of this cathedral was actually the full three-dimensional cross. Or should I say, the multi-cross that represents the fourth dimension, the Tesseract. And this is one of the main reasons why I continue to push that theory of the Tesseract. And when you go around and you look at the floor to Florence Cathedral, and if you can actually visit it, and I strongly recommend you do if you ever have the means, or if not, do your own explorations, you can get the impression of how there's something in this cathedral that matches the other cathedrals, and yet at the same time seems to be far beyond the other cathedrals. Indeed, looking at these particular organ devices that are towards the front. It's very clear that this cathedral has been modified over the years and changed in many different ways. And indeed, looking up in the dome, you have something that's even more impressive than the oculus, in addition to the portal windows. So what are your thoughts on the Cathedral of Florence? And what are your thoughts on the theory that this structure may have had vastly different original functions? Well, thank you for joining me, and I hope you enjoyed this exploration.
I'd love to stay, but...
Knights! Squires! Prepare for battle!
Greetings, channel members, and today we're going to explore the Palace of Parliament in a little bit more of an informal and casual exploration. Now, I started off with the opening aerial footage of the Palace of Parliament in Bucharest, Romania, because I don't believe images do its scale true justice. And indeed, even in this image in Wikipedia, we can see it's as though they're trying to conceal the scale a little bit. You also can't appreciate some of the fine detailing that goes off in this particular structure. Now, this was the passion project of the Romanian Communist Party under the terrifying regime of Nicolae Ceausescu, or Ceausescu, or however you say his last name. Let's see what it is.
Nicolae Ceausescu.
Oh, Nicolae Ceausescu. Yes, I remember how to pronounce it. It's been a while since I've done actual research on this particular individual. But we have our standard Romanian Communist Party, and we have the usual story that comes along with them, that they had all these terrifying implementations that they wanted to do, and this palace that was constructed by Nicolae Ceausescu was supposed to be his main palace where he was going to reside. And ultimately, it cost him his life. When we look at some of the details, though, about it, I'm just going to skim through the Wikipedia article, we can see that we have the usual story. Now, what's interesting about this is that this was constructed from 1984 until 1997. Very recent construction. And we're even told that it had one architect, Anca Petrescu, and she had 700 architects under her direction. Now, doesn't that seem like a strange account? Doesn't that seem like a little too many cooks in the kitchen, especially for architects? I'm kind of reminded, though, of the relationship that we had with William Randolph Hearst and Julia Morgan when they constructed Hearst Castle in California. But regardless, we have the story of a contest being held and won by Anca Petrescu, who was appointed chief architect of the project at the age of 28. She must have been quite the prodigy, and quite frankly, a genius to be able to complete this. Now, look into some of the details that went into this. They tell us they leveled a hill, they destroyed a neighborhood, they removed national archives. Hey, there you go again, moving national archives, all to build a building. How about that? Monasteries, hospitals, 37 old factories and workshops, and dislocated 40,000 people just to build this thing. Now, once again, you can see from a distance that it doesn't really give you the impression of all its opulence. And this is the front yard and what remains of the neighborhood that was demolished. And yes, I say front yard with all consistency of my total sarcasm. What's interesting, though, is that we have this story that still rhymes with many of the earlier stories that we saw of construction of very incredible edifices from the 1800s. And yet here we have this story in 1984 to 1987. Well, I did have a full assembly of images that were unfortunately lost when we had the incident that occurred a couple weeks ago on the channel, but our friends at the Yomatic site actually have assembled some images that we're going to be looking on for some interior. And oddly enough, this particular individual who runs this site has quite a unique flavor of how he conveys the story. So let's look at some of the images inside the world's most ridiculously extravagant communist building. Now, it should be noted that what do we think of with communist buildings? We typically think of brutalist architecture, and we have anything but here. Now, they try to say that it's neoclassical or neo-neoclassical mixed in with some sort of communist architecture. It's really bizarre. But when we look at it, we see the same stylings that we've seen in many other images. The very beautiful and geometrically precise floor, the geometric precision of the ceiling, and some of the pillars and the columns. Now, it's quite an account that they say that they built this by an architect winning a competition, and they had 700 architects working for her, and they had thousands of soldiers and people that they pulled off the street, sound familiar, who completed this and did this in 13 years, 1984, 1997. Good luck finding construction images, and good luck finding schematics from this. We'll look into Anka here in a little bit, or excuse me, Anka, make sure I pronounce the name properly. And here's what he says. He has an unwavering love of communist architecture, and this is this individual, Nate Robert. He's the one who's the founder of Yomatic. And you can see in his image that he has that classic look of the academic or military officer sycophant who's there at staff meetings and is typically one of those operations officers types who's not going to tell you all the details, purposely withhold information from you, and then dime you out in front of your boss to make you look bad because he's just that kind of person. I'm not saying that Nate is that kind of person. I'm just saying that he has that stereotypical look. I'll let you read his own words with me and develop your own opinion of him because he's pretty open here on what is really a blog. He does have a good assembly of images, though. Well, excuse my casually flippant attitude, but as a Gen Xer, born and raised in the capitalist West on a steady diet provided by Hollywood and a color TV, we had them everywhere when I was growing up, I would just say potato, potato. Either way, all communist architecture I've featured on Yomatic to date is modernist-inspired, mid-century constructed, gray, concrete, geometric, decayed, brutalist, and just a little dystopian. All the things I love. That is until now. Yes, this is something that stands out quite a bit. Look at this particular image. It's very impressive chandelier, very incredible architectural detailing with this entire assembly room. Now remember, we're told that this was supposed to be the main palace for the communist president of Romania, good old Nicolae. And you can see, though, that when we look on the inside of it, we do see it is really a palace. And the explanation behind it was, well, you had the crazed dictator who wanted to do anything. And even though his nation was in an economic downturn at the time in the 1980s, he diverted all resources to construct this incredible palace. And it just happens to work really well as a Palace of Parliament. Indeed, in many of the images, we see some of the greatest architectural stylings that we've seen in numerous other explorations, with the pillars integrated into the walls, the very finely decorated ceiling. Now, does this really give you the impression of any kind of building that was built by anybody from 1984 to 1997, especially when you consider its size and eminence? And by the way, they also tell us that this building is not even finished yet. That pattern looks awfully familiar, doesn't it? Isn't it odd to see it in Romania, especially when we consider Romania's World War II history? But I digress. I really wonder what these materials actually are, though. And this is why this is on tab for an on-site exploration, because I really have to get on site and assess this building in person. But looking at these images, it's just awe-inspiring. I mean, we have numerous chandeliers. We have the same kind of indentations, decorations, and detailing and geographic precision that goes in the ceiling that we've seen in many of the finest old world buildings from the 1800s. Now, I'm not going to say that this exactly compares with many of the palaces that we've looked at across the Midwest, but the size is very impressive. And indeed, it does match in several aspects, especially with the columns and the pillars. Remember, this was constructed by soldiers and people they pulled off the street. I'm kind of reminded of that Basilica of St. Josephat in Milwaukee, where we're told that they just pulled parishioners and newly arrived immigrants in Milwaukee off the street to build that. Look at some of this precision and beauty, though, on the interior of this building. It really has to be seen to be believed. But then on the outside, and this is why you really have to get close to it, you would miss all this detail, the fine detailing in the columns, the different types of columns even. Now, this does look sectional, but still, up here, the ornamentation on the top of it. Really? This was constructed by soldiers and people they pulled off the streets after they leveled the neighborhood? After they pulled down an entire hill? And what was it, 37 factories? It just gets absurd when you consider this account, especially when it rhymes with the other older accounts that we have. Here we have the columns, and look at this grand entryway. This kind of reminds me of several of the Fox theaters that we looked at, especially with the chandelier and this wonderful ceiling. Just beauty everywhere that you look within this structure. This is not a communist structure. I don't care what they tell us. This is something we'd expect to see in cathedrals and other little details that we've seen and other of the architectural examples of the old world that we've looked at. And indeed, in this closer image, which I will give our good friend Nate here credit for, he does show a little bit of the detail that you won't see on the building in the overall pan shots or the establishing shots. You don't see all these portal windows. You don't see all the arches and details. You don't see the balcony and all the effort that went into it. And then, of course, the fine construction of the blocks here that we've seen in many star forts. Doesn't that symbol look familiar? What exactly is that doing in a communist building that was built in Romania in 1984 to 1997? But some of the beauty on the inside of this is just beyond the ability of words to convey once again. And I suspect that we're looking at some old structure that they repurposed, cleaned up, or rebuilt. Or again, maybe there's some other entire explanation for it. And I certainly invite you to tell me what you think in the comments. Maybe you think that this is some sort of third era building that survived through a reset and was kept secret, and that could be possible too. Although I strongly suspect this is a fourth era structure, I could be wrong. They try to legitimize this building by saying that many politicians, such as Angela Merkel and George Bush, gave speeches out here. And oh, yeah, Michael Jackson did a concert out in front of this building as well. I don't see how that's remotely relevant to its size and imminence and its overall beauty, but different aspects of it betray what they're trying to convey with it, such as with the Wikipedia article. You wouldn't realize that there's this kind of beauty within the building. And a lot of people overlook the interior, and yet I think the real story of the building is in the interior. Look at some of this. I mean, this matches all the finest structures that we've seen on the inside. It's just something I'd need to examine in person to make sure that the quality of construction materials matches what I've seen in state capitals, university buildings across the land. But I suspect that it does. Now, Nate's article gets very interesting because he talks about how the building is not necessarily larger than the Pentagon, but it's pretty close as an administration building. And then they talk about the legacy of dictator Nicolae Ceausescu. I struggle with Romanian names, okay? I'm not going to try to pretend that I don't. And then he descends into some wonderful profanity. Ceausescu was a grade A asshole. Boy, this guy's very eloquent, isn't he? I'm not insulting him. It's just funny that he's a little bit of a blogger and he sets up travel trips and it's a travel blog, supposedly. And then he goes off talking about how terrifying this individual was, and certainly he was. But what I find interesting, though, is that when old Nicolae and his wife were executed after a revolt against the communist regime in Romania in 1989, oh, yeah, look at this. Yeah, I'm sure this is exactly what happened. Looks like he's going a little bit overboard. I think our good friend Nate here is actually showing a little bit of the quote-unquote bloodlust that he's gained by reading this story. Imagine if you just told him that he had Nicolae in front of him and he had the opportunity to shoot him, even if it wasn't really Nicolae. Do you think he'd pull the trigger? I bet he just might. But anyway, I don't mean to digress on that. I'm just saying that if you read this article here, and I'll attach it in the link so you can check out the images yourself, you can see that Nate seems to be jumping on that whole bloodlust concept because people always seem to dive onto that for some reason. And here's what he's known for. Nate Robert, founder of Yomatic, and he organizes these little trips, and you're going to go and look at communist architecture. And like I said, he does have that haircut and that look as though he's one of those classic administrative sycophants, but not going to hold it against him. At least he had some great images of the palace. Now, let's look up the story of Anca Petrescu. Now, she was the architect behind this. And interestingly enough, even though she was well known as the architect of this building from start to finish, she was not held accountable for the thousands of people who supposedly died in its construction. Yes, there's a conflicting account on that as well. Some sources say only 24 people died in constructing this incredible palace. Other sources say over thousands. I don't know what to tell you. What I can tell you, though, is that Anca here was not held responsible. In fact, she was actually elected to the Romanian parliament in the 2000s. So, I guess that just goes to show you. She was just the architect doing what the dictator told her to do. It wasn't her fault. Apparently, she died in a car crash. Isn't that interesting? After winning the contest when she was a 28-year-old prodigy. And here they correctly state that the palace is the world's second largest administrative building after the Pentagon. Subsequently, there is now a larger administration building in India, which is a diamond trade center. And look at this. Yes, this brutalist nightmare. Ugh. I'll tell you what, if there is a hell for each of us, this is probably where I'd be sent, to be stuck in a cubicle doing academic reviews until the end of time. If hell were more than a concept, but just thought I'd share that with you. Back to Anca, though, we get a little bit of a biography about her, and she seems to come across as an enigmatic character. The other thing that's enigmatic is we also have who these 700 architects were who supposedly assisted her. And how the hell did she manage 700 architects? Oh, now I'm dropping profanity. That's what I get after reading our good friend Nate's article. That's why I try to refrain from using profanity as much as possible. It's not that I have any sort of moral difficulty with it. It's just the fact that once you start using it, it starts to, we'll just say, hijack your adjectives. And I don't prefer to do that. But in any event, how exactly did she manage all those architects? I think that's an impressive achievement in and of itself, having that many cooks in the kitchen, and yet they were able to get a coherent building. Yet good luck finding construction photos of this palace, although some have started to crop up, surprise, surprise, much like any other old world building, which is suddenly discovered and explored. And we look at how she actually received criticism when the regime fell. but they seem to forget about it. And in fact, Romanians have since come to appreciate the palace. I mean, why wouldn't they? It's a beautiful building. Its tenets include the parliament, constitution. Oh, and then here they justify it. Michael Jackson moonwalked in front of it. President George W. Bush gave a speech there. Vladimir Putin was there, and German Chancellor Angela Merkel. All the coolest people all made speeches there. And so that legitimizes it. So even though Anka won a contest, she somehow managed to centralize the efforts of 700 different architects, and then she unfortunately passed away in a car accident. This is this account we have for this Palace of Parliament. So, what are your thoughts on this Palace of Parliament? What do you think of some of these images? And by all means, look at this article on your own and tell me your thoughts. I mean, do you think that there's any possibility that our current civilization could have constructed this building? Do you think there's any possibility to this story of this contest, these 700 architects, and this genius Anka? And if Anka really was this kind of genius, then why weren't other people using her and her architectural prowess to erect other wondrous structures like this? Well, she wanted to become a politician. Okay, that's fine. You know, the terrifying communist regime ended. It often comes across with that, though, that we see the same principles, though, whether it's a capitalist or a communist government. Because at the end of the day, if you recall our exploration on Mr. Hobbes' assertion of what government is a sovereign. It doesn't matter whether it's a monarchy, a democracy, or in this case, a communist despotic regime. They all ultimately serve the same purpose. And according to Mr. Hobbes, the people of Romania had no right to execute their dictator. They never should have done that, because according to Hobbes, that was illegal. Make of it what you will. Now, is that what really happened, or is that just a story that we're told to keep us placated? I don't know. Again, I ask you to let me know your opinion in the comments. I always invite it. Look at some of this, though, above these portal windows, though, and the detail going into this. And this is why I wanted to look back at this, because you could probably spend weeks or months examining every explicit architectural detail in this impressive palace, and you would still be awed every day. And so I think when it comes down to just the number of architectural details and the amount of time you could devote to looking at this Palace of Parliament, you have what appears to be some sort of bona fide old world building. Although I'll admit right now I'm at a bit of a loss to explain it. Is it some strange nexus building that came through a portal and overlapping of realities and timelines, or is it something that was just hidden from the 4th era to the 5th era? I always keep my mind open to theories, because if you start closing yourself off to theories, then suddenly you lack the ability to come up with a good theory. Look at some of these windows here. Very impressive. Almost kind of reminds me of the Emperor's portal window on Return of the Jedi. Remember that? Anyway, well, thank you for joining me. Let me know what your thoughts are on the Palace of Parliament in Bucharest, Romania.